The year was 1805, and Europe trembled under the shadow of one man's ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of continental warfare, had crushed armies from Austria to Prussia, bending nations to his will. Yet there remained one barrier he could not break, one enemy that stood defiantly between him and total dominion over Europe. The English Channel, that narrow stretch of water, protected by the wooden walls of the Royal Navy, and commanded by a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of French admirals. This is the story of Horatio Nelson, a figure so legendary that his final battle would echo through history for centuries. On the 21st of October, 1805, off the coast of Spain near Cape Trafalgar, two mighty fleets would collide in a battle that would decide the fate of nations. What followed was not merely a naval engagement, but the birth of a legend that would rule the seas for over a century. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Trafalgar, we must first journey back to the making of the man himself. Horatio Nelson was born on a crisp September morning in 1758, in the quiet Norfolk village of Burnham Thorpe. The sixth of 11 children born to Reverend Edmund Nelson and his wife Catherine, young Horatio, entered a world far removed from the thunder of cannon and the spray of salt water that would define his destiny. The Nelson family was genteel, scholarly, and desperately poor. When his mother died and Nelson was just 9 years old, the boy's world shifted forever. It was a harsh childhood marked by self-denial and frugality, where eyes were considered a luxury the even spectacles for weak family could not afford. Yet fate has a way of shaping greatness from the most unlikely circumstances. Nelson's salvation came through his mother's brother, Captain Maurice Suckling, a high-ranking officer in His Majesty's Navy. On the 1st of January, 1771, a 12-year-old boy with fragile health and an uncertain future reported aboard HMS Raisonnable as an ordinary seaman. The muster book recorded his name as Horace Nelson from Wells, aged 12, appointed midshipman. What the official records could not capture was the irony that this future master of the seas suffered from chronic seasickness, a torment that would plague him throughout his legendary career. The young Nelson's early years in the Navy were a mixture of mundane routine and extraordinary adventure. He learned seamanship in the Thames estuary, where the river's familiar waters taught him the basics of navigation and command. But adventure called from distant shores, and soon he found himself sailing to the West Indies aboard a merchant vessel, experiencing the exotic dangers of tropical waters. In 1773, he joined a scientific expedition to the Arctic, a dangerous venture that tested his courage and endurance against the brutal forces of nature. These formative experiences forged something remarkable in the young officer, a combination of technical skill and fearless determination that would serve him well in the battles to come. The Indian Ocean provided Nelson with his first taste of real action, but fever struck him down, probably malaria, and he was invalided home in a state of deep depression. It was during his recovery that something extraordinary happened. Nelson experienced what he would later describe as a dramatic surge of optimism, a moment of clarity that revealed his destiny. From that instant, his ambition blazed like a beacon, fired by patriotism and tempered by the Christian compassion instilled by his father. He was determined to prove himself the equal of his distinguished naval kinsman, no matter the cost. In 1777, Nelson passed his examination for lieutenant and sailed immediately for the West Indies, the most active theater in Britain's war against the American colonies. The Caribbean was a cauldron of conflict where British, French, Spanish, and American forces clashed amid tropical storms and deadly diseases. It was here that Nelson's talents truly began to shine. In 1779, at the remarkably young age of 20, he was promoted to captain and given command of a frigate. Few officers in naval history had risen so quickly through the ranks, but Nelson's combination of tactical brilliance and personal courage marked him as exceptional. His early commands took him to the Spanish settlements of Nicaragua, where Britain sought to strike at Spain after it joined France, in alliance with the American revolutionaries. The expedition was a disaster that nearly claimed Nelson's life. Yellow fever swept through the British force like a scythe, cutting down men by the hundreds. Nelson himself barely survived, one of the few to escape the disease that turned the tropical paradise into a graveyard. Yet even in failure, he learned valuable lessons about leadership, logistics, and the brutal realities of warfare in hostile climates. The end of the American War of Independence brought peace, but for naval officers like Nelson, peace meant unemployment. He found himself on half pay, a common fate for officers when their services were no longer required. These were difficult years, marked by financial hardship and professional uncertainty. In 1784, he received command of a frigate bound for the West Indies, but this commission brought more trouble than glory. Nelson rigidly enforced the Navigation Act against American ships that were still trading with British privileges they had officially lost. His strict adherence to the law made enemies among merchants, shipowners, and even British authorities who had failed to enforce regulations for their own profit. But the storm clouds gathering over Europe would soon provide Nelson with the stage upon which his legend would be written. The French Revolution had unleashed forces that would reshape the continent, and by the 1790s, Britain found itself locked in a life-and-death struggle with revolutionary France. The Royal Navy became Britain's shield and sword, the only force capable of standing between the island nation and the revolutionary armies that swept across Europe like a tide of fire and steel. Nelson's rise to legendary status began during these French Revolutionary Wars. In 1794, while fighting in Corsica, a piece of stone and sand struck by an enemy shot permanently blinded him in his right eye. Rather than ending his career, this injury seemed to fuel his determination. 3 years later, at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, Nelson achieved fame through an act of inspired insubordination. When the British line threatened to let Spanish ships escape, Nelson pulled his ship out of formation and engaged 2 enemy vessels simultaneously. His audacious attack helped secure victory and made him a hero in the eyes of the British public. Yet glory came at a price. Later that same year, at the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife, Nelson lost his right arm to a musket ball. The injury was severe, requiring immediate amputation, and he was forced to return to Britain to recuperate. Many would have considered such wounds a sign to retire from active service, but Nelson was not like other men. His disabilities only seemed to enhance his mystique, marking him as a warrior who had sacrificed his body for king and country. The Battle of the Nile in 1798 established Nelson as one of Britain's greatest naval commanders. After weeks of anxiously searching the Mediterranean for Napoleon's fleet, he finally discovered the French ships anchored in Abu Qir Bay. What followed was a masterpiece of tactical innovation that would become the template for Nelson's future victories. Instead of engaging in the traditional line of battle, Nelson divided his force and attacked the French from both sides simultaneously. The battle began at sunset, with the French commander assuming the British would not attack so late in the day. But Nelson understood that darkness would work to his advantage. His ships snaked through the narrow gap between the French line and the shore, catching the enemy completely off guard. The climax came when the French flagship L'Orient, the largest ship in the bay, exploded in a massive fireball that could be seen for miles. The destruction was so complete that only 2 French ships of the line escaped. The victory at the Nile transformed Nelson from a celebrated captain into a national icon. When news reached London, church bells rang across the kingdom and crowds gathered in the streets to celebrate. The Admiralty promoted him to Baron Nelson of the Nile, and Parliament voted him a pension for life. But perhaps more importantly, the battle established Nelson's reputation among his fellow officers as a tactical genius who could achieve the impossible through sheer audacity and brilliant planning. Yet Nelson's greatest triumph still lay ahead, waiting in the waters off Cape Trafalgar. By 1805, Napoleon had abandoned his dreams of invading Britain directly and turned his attention to the continent, where he crushed Austrian and Russian armies at Austerlitz. But the spectre of British naval power continued to haunt his ambitions. As long as the Royal Navy controlled the seas, Britain could strangle French trade, supply Napoleon's enemies, and remain forever beyond his grasp. The French emperor knew that naval supremacy was the key to ultimate victory. If he could combine the French and Spanish fleets, he might achieve temporary control of the English Channel, long enough to transport his Grande Armée across those narrow waters. The invasion barges had been gathering in French ports for months, and 200,000 veteran soldiers waited for their chance to march on London. All that stood between Napoleon and his dream of total European dominion was the wooden walls of the Royal Navy, and the man who commanded them. That man was now Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, Knight of the Bath, Duke of Bronte, and the most feared naval commander in the world. His reputation had grown with each successive victory, and French sailors spoke his name in hushed whispers. Spanish captains crossed themselves when they heard he was at sea. Even Napoleon himself acknowledged Nelson's genius, once remarking that the English admiral was worth 40,000 men in battle. But Nelson was more than just a tactical innovator. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to inspire his subordinates, transforming ordinary seamen into heroes willing to follow him into the mouth of hell. His captains adored him, calling themselves Nelson's band of brothers, and his crews would sail their ships into the jaws of death if their admiral commanded it. This bond between commander and commanded was forged through years of shared hardship, mutual respect, and Nelson's genuine care for the men who served under him. The stage was set for the final confrontation when the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, under Admiral Villeneuve, sailed from Cadiz on October 18th. 33 ships of the line, including the massive Spanish Santísima Trinidad, with her 4 decks and 140 guns, represented the most powerful naval force ever assembled against Britain. Villeneuve was a competent officer who understood the stakes, but he also knew the reputation of the man hunting him across the Atlantic swells. Nelson's fleet was smaller, just 27 ships of the line, but every vessel was manned by crews hardened through years of blockade duty. While the French and Spanish sailors had spent months cooped up in harbor, drilling in theory but lacking practical experience, the British had been constantly at sea. They had beaten back and forth off the European coast in all weather, their guns' crews drilled to mechanical perfection, their officers seasoned by countless actions against enemy squadrons attempting to break the blockade. The British commander had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. Traditional naval tactics called for 2 fleets to form parallel lines and pound each other with broadsides until one side broke. But Nelson had studied Villeneuve's methods and knew the French admiral would expect such an approach. Instead, he planned something audacious, something that violated every principle taught in naval academies, but might just achieve the decisive victory Britain desperately needed. On the morning of October 21st, as dawn broke over the Atlantic, Nelson's ships formed into 2 columns, racing directly toward the enemy line. It was a tactic so unorthodox that many of his own officers questioned its wisdom. Sailing perpendicular to the Franco-Spanish formation meant that the leading British ships would absorb tremendous punishment while unable to return fire effectively. The enemy would rake them with devastating broadsides, while Nelson's columns could only reply with their forward guns. But the British admiral understood something his enemies did not. He knew that French and Spanish gun crews, cooped up in port for months, lacked the speed and accuracy that came only from constant practice. He gambled that his superior seamanship and gunnery would allow his ships to punch through the enemy line before taking fatal damage. More importantly, he knew that once his ships were among the Franco-Spanish fleet, their superior training would tell in the close-quarters combat that would follow. Nelson's battle plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would divide his force into 2 columns, one led by his flagship HMS Victory, the other by his trusted second-in-command, Admiral Collingwood aboard HMS Royal Sovereign. The 2 columns would strike the enemy line at different points, breaking it into 3 separate sections. Unable to support each other effectively, the isolated enemy ships could be overwhelmed by superior British gunnery and seamanship. The night before battle, Nelson summoned his captains aboard Victory for a final conference. In his great cabin, surrounded by the men who had followed him through countless actions, he outlined his plans with quiet confidence. There would be no complex signals during the fight, no elaborate maneuvers that might be misunderstood in the heat of battle. Instead, Nelson gave his subordinates a simple instruction that embodied his entire tactical philosophy. No captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of the enemy. As his captains returned to their vessels in the darkness, Nelson remained on deck, staring out at the lights of the enemy fleet barely visible on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring the greatest naval battle in history, a clash that would determine whether Britain remained free or fell under Napoleon's dominion. The weight of an empire rested on his shoulders, but Nelson felt no fear. He had prepared his entire life for this moment, and he was ready to meet his destiny among the rolling swells of the Atlantic. The dawn of October 21st broke grey and misty over the Atlantic, the sea rolling in long swells that lifted and dropped the opposing fleets like toys in a giant's bathtub. Aboard HMS Victory, Nelson stood on the quarterdeck in his blue and gold uniform, the stars and medals glinting in the pale morning light. He had chosen to wear his full-dress uniform, complete with the bright decorations that marked him as one of Britain's most honoured officers. His officers had begged him to change, knowing that the glittering awards would make him a prime target for enemy marksmen, but Nelson refused. On this day of all days, he would meet the enemy as what he was, the commander of the Royal Navy and the defender of England. As the morning mist lifted, the full magnitude of the Franco-Spanish fleet became visible. 33 ships stretched across the horizon in a great crescent, their hulls black against the grey sky, their masts and rigging forming a forest of wood and rope. The sight would have intimidated lesser men, but Nelson studied the enemy formation with the eye of a master tactician. He could see that Villeneuve had arranged his ships in the traditional line of battle, exactly as expected. The French admiral was following the textbook, and that would be his downfall. Nelson's own fleet had spent the dark hours forming into two columns as planned. HMS Royal Sovereign led the southern column, her copper bottom gleaming as she rode the swells, while Victory headed the northern division. Between the two columns sailed 25 more ships of the line, each one a floating fortress bristling with cannon and manned by crews who had trained for this moment their entire careers. The wind was light but favourable, filling the British sails and driving them steadily toward their destiny. At 11:30, Nelson ordered his most famous signal hoisted to Victory's masthead. The message spelled out in flags read, "England expects that every man will do his duty." As the signal broke out and was repeated down the line, a tremendous cheer rose from the British ships. Sailors climbed into the rigging to wave their hats, while Marines presented arms on the quarterdecks. Even the normally taciturn Collingwood, commanding the southern column, was moved by the gesture, though he muttered that he wished Nelson would make no more signals, since they all understood what they were to do. The approach to battle seemed to take an eternity. For over 2 hours, the British columns sailed directly toward the enemy line, while 33 enemy ships waited with loaded guns. The tension was unbearable as men stood at their stations, watching the Franco-Spanish fleet grow larger with each passing minute. French and Spanish gun crews tracked the approaching vessels, adjusting their aim as the range steadily decreased. The silence was broken only by the creak of rigging, the splash of waves against hulls, and the steady commands of officers preparing their men for the carnage to come. Aboard the enemy flagship Bucentaure, Admiral Villeneuve watched the British approach with growing unease. He had fought Nelson before and knew the English admiral's reputation for unorthodox tactics. The perpendicular attack violated every principle of naval warfare, but Villeneuve suspected there was method in Nelson's apparent madness. As the British columns drew closer, he could see that they were aiming for specific points in his line, seeking to break it into isolated sections that could be overwhelmed piecemeal. The first shots rang out just after noon as HMS Royal Sovereign, leading the southern column, came within range of the Spanish ship Fougueux. Collingwood's flagship had outdistanced her consorts and found herself alone facing a dozen enemy vessels. Broadsides crashed into Royal Sovereign's hull, sending splinters flying across her decks and cutting down men at their guns. But Collingwood pressed on, knowing that every minute of punishment he absorbed brought the rest of his column closer to the enemy line. At 20 minutes past 12, Royal Sovereign finally reached the Franco-Spanish line and cut through it like a sword thrust. Her first broadside, fired at point-blank range into the stern of the Spanish flagship Santa Ana, was devastating. 50 guns fired simultaneously, their shots smashing through the enemy's stern windows and raking the entire length of her gun decks. Men fell in heaps as the iron balls bounced and ricocheted through the confined space, turning the Spanish ship's interior into a charnel house. The breakthrough had begun. One by one, Collingwood's ships followed Royal Sovereign through the gap, each vessel firing crushing broadsides into the helpless sterns of enemy ships. The Franco-Spanish line began to crumble as individual vessels found themselves isolated and surrounded by British ships, whose gun crews had been trained to reload and fire faster than any other navy in the world. Within minutes, The southern end of Villeneuve's formation was dissolving into chaos. Meanwhile, Nelson's northern column was approaching its target point in the enemy line. HMS Victory, her massive bulk cutting through the swells, bore down on the gap between Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaure and the giant French 74 Redoutable. Enemy shot crashed into Victory's hull and rigging, bringing down her mizzen topmast and carving great furrows in her thick oak sides. Nelson walked calmly along the quarterdeck beside his flag captain Thomas Hardy, apparently oblivious to the iron storm raging around them. The approach seemed to last forever as Victory absorbed punishment from multiple enemy ships. Her wheel was shot away, forcing the helmsman below decks to steer by emergency tackle. Grapeshot swept her upper decks, cutting down marines and seamen at their stations. Yet the great ship pressed on, her gun crews crouched behind their cannons, waiting for the moment when they could reply to the enemy's fire. At 1 o'clock, Victory finally reached the Franco-Spanish line. Finding the gap between Bucentaure and Redoutable too narrow to pass through safely, Nelson ordered his ship turned slightly to starboard. Victory's massive bow crashed into Redoutable's stern, the two ships grinding together in a deadly embrace. At point-blank range, Victory's guns roared their answer to the enemy's fire. Her lower deck 32-pounders, loaded with double shot, smashed through Redoutable's stern and sent iron death racing through the French ship's gun decks. The melee had begun in earnest. Ship after ship from Nelson's column broke through the enemy line, each vessel immediately engaging the nearest enemy in the brutal close-quarters combat that the British Navy had perfected through decades of war. The air filled with the thunder of cannon, the crash of falling masts, and the screams of wounded men. Smoke rolled across the water in choking clouds, turning day into a hellish twilight where ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Individual duels erupted throughout the battle area as British ships found themselves locked in combat with French and Spanish opponents. HMS Temeraire, following Victory through the line, found herself engaged with both Redoutable and the French Fougueux. Her gun crews worked like machines, loading and firing with mechanical precision while enemy shot crashed through her sides. Captain Eliab Harvey walked his quarterdeck with the same calm dignity as his admiral, encouraging his men and directing the fight with quiet competence. The superior training of British crews began to tell as the battle reached its climax. While French and Spanish gunners struggled to reload their weapons in the smoke and confusion, British gun crews maintained their devastating rate of fire. Ships that had taken years to build were reduced to floating wrecks in minutes as concentrated broadsides smashed through their sides and brought down their masts in tangled heaps of wood and rigging. But Victory was not without cost. HMS Victory, locked alongside the French Redoutable, found herself under attack from enemy marines in the Frenchman's fighting tops. Musket balls swept Victory's quarterdeck. Cutting was from down officers and men with these elevated positions that the shot would come that would transform deadly precision. It a great naval victory into a national tragedy, ensuring that October 21st would be remembered not just as Britain's greatest naval triumph, but as the day the Royal Navy lost its greatest hero. The battle raged with increasing fury as more British ships broke through the shattered enemy line. What had begun as an orderly formation dissolved into dozens of individual combats, each one a struggle to the death between wooden ships and iron men. The fate of Europe hung in the balance as cannon roared and heroes fell, writing their names in blood and glory on the pages of history. At 15 minutes past 1, as Victory lay locked in her deadly embrace with Redoutable, a single musket ball fired from the French ship's mizzen top found its mark. The shot struck Nelson in his left shoulder, piercing his lung and lodging deep in his spine. The admiral knew instantly that the wound was mortal, gasping to Hardy that they had done for him at last, that his backbone was shot through. As his officers carried him below deck, Nelson insisted his face be covered, understanding that the sight of their fallen commander would shatter the morale of his men. For 3 agonizing hours, Nelson lay dying in Victory's orlop deck as the battle raged above his head. Yet he lived long enough to hear the sweetest words any commander could wish for. Hardy came below to report that the enemy fleet was defeated, that 22 Franco-Spanish ships had surrendered or been destroyed, while not a single British vessel was lost. Nelson's tactical masterpiece had achieved the impossible, a victory so complete that it would echo through the centuries. His final words, spoken with his last breath, captured the essence of the man who had given everything for his country. Thank God I have done my duty. At 4:30 on that October afternoon, Horatio Nelson passed into legend, his body broken but his spirit triumphant. The Battle of Trafalgar was won. Napoleon's dreams of invasion were shattered forever, and the Royal Navy's dominion over the world's oceans was secured for more than a century to come. From that day forward, Britannia truly ruled the waves, and the name of Nelson became synonymous with courage, genius, and the unbreakable spirit of those who serve their nation unto death.